People who work at remote places, what creepiest things have you noticed while at work? My previous partner was an amateur industrial archaeology photographer, so we were often hiking to semi-remote locations to find abandoned factories, mills, storage facilities, etc. Being pretty far from civilization, they were almost always completely empty. We found syringes and trash in several ones that were closer to cities or towns, and once a homeless person living inside, but nothing ever dangerous or creepy, except once. This was a massive paper mill located over a now dry stream, pretty deep within the mountain. Think a couple hours hike away from the closest village. It was still in decent conditions, all things considered, but definitely abandoned. We'd been in less than half an hour taking pictures of the main building, which was still standing and had two exit points. One was the main entrance from which we had come in, and the other was the half-collapsed door that led further into the factory. We were about to move deeper in when we heard what seemed like several dogs growling and barking aggressively. We figured it was probably another group of hikers with their dogs passing by, so we remained inside. And after a couple minutes, the growling stopped. We got back at taking pictures of a peculiar pyramid-shaped mound of debris when the growling started again, but much closer. I was starting to freak out as I thought it might be rabid dogs and we had no way to protect ourselves. We tried to gather where they were coming from and move in the other direction, when suddenly the growls and barks turned into screaming, quickly getting closer. We were properly freaked out at that point and started running to the main exit, when a gigantic man covered in rags jumped in from the other entrance, yelling and screaming at us things we couldn't understand in what was surely not our language. We sprinted out of there like crazy and run back to the trail, and didn't stop for a good 5 minutes before I couldn't keep up anymore and had to stop to breathe. We were terrified, but the man hadn't followed us outside the building and likely had no interest in pursuit once he got us to leave. Still, we did the 2-hour hike back in a little over 1 hour, as the scare definitely motivated us. In hindsight, it was probably just a homeless drug addict wanting to be left alone with his dogs, and the language he had screamed at us in was likely a dialect. But the fact that we didn't see any other sign of anyone living there, no trash or clothes or food, and the ghost dogs, plus the remote location, left me a very creepy impression of the whole encounter. Story 2. I used to work at a summer camp. Usually the kids would go to bed by 9 p.m. at the latest, so the rest of us would just hang out around a fire or something. One night, one of the kids came to the fire pit, which was about 100 yards from the cabin, saying that she was having trouble sleeping because of the noise. So I walk back with her and make sure everything is good in the cabin, and come back and tell everybody to keep it down. Maybe 10 minutes later, she comes back and says that she still can't fall asleep. I walk back with her again, and in my head, I'm thinking that she's just being restless because we aren't being loud. But anyways, I make sure she's under covers and head back to the fire pit. Just as I'm about to get there, I realize that I left my walkie-talkie in her room, so I head back and see that she's sitting upright in bed with the walkie-talkie in her hand. I'm thinking, okay, whatever, and tell her to go to sleep. I head back to the fire pit, and the guys are like, "Why did you say that to her?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And they're like, "We heard you on the walkie-talkie tell her that she would look better if she shaved her head, that all little girls look better with shaved heads." I never said that, and nobody believed me. And it was obviously not her saying it either, since it was a grown man's voice. I rushed back to check on the cabin, and everything was normal. Story 3. A buddy of mine had a mine maintenance job for a summer. The mine was in the middle of nowhere, and deactivated at the time. There was just one other person, a crusty old-timer, and they didn't really do anything but keep the weeds down and make sure nothing was leaking or rusting out. It was a very low-key job. Twice a month, a plane would fly in to deliver supplies. One day, about 3 months in, my friend was just walking along the river that ran near the site, and he heard what he swore was like a church choir and organ music in the distance. He was pretty sure that there was no settlement within 100 miles, but nevertheless, he decided to try to find the source of the music. He wandered miles downstream following the river, but the sound never got any louder. Finally, he decided to get the F back to camp because he'd wandered off really far in bear-infested woods without any protection. The music faded before he got back to camp, and he realized that it was such a peculiar experience, he was reluctant to mention it to his coworker in case he thought he was crazy. The following day, he did mention it and asked if there was an Indian reserve or some other settlement with a church in area. His coworker replied, "No, man, nothing like that here, and I've been here 10 years. Looks like you're bushwhacked. You need to get out of here." He left on the next plane. Story 4. I used to work for an IT company in the gaming industry, whose office was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by farms and forest. One day, one of the development team had come in from a walk in the forest and was visibly upset. Turns out, she came across a dead fox. The thing that was concerning is that she said it was hanging from a tree and looks like it was put there on purpose. So a bit later on, a few of us went down to have a look. We came across a small clearing with the dead fox hanging there. Upon closer inspection, we realized it had been hung by its neck, with an incision from its balls to its throat and all of its insides pulled out. Felt pretty sick from that one. We got it down from the branch and chucked it into the bushes, away from the path and clearing. Still to this day, we have no idea how or why it was in that state. Story 5. I used to own a horse boarding and training farm with about 45 acres surrounded by woods. I used to spend the night there quite a bit because I had to start chores early in the morning, so if I stayed too late, it wasn't worth it to drive home. One night at about midnight, my dog started to bristle up and growl at the door of the office I slept in. And then my iPod, which I kept on a speaker in the middle of the barn, started blasting out Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire at full volume, which I definitely hadn't left it on. Let me tell you, that song is ducking freaky as crap in the middle of the night. Like crap your pants freaky. My dog was full on growling and barking at the door, so I cracked it and let him run out, figuring that if someone were in or around the barn, he'd get them. Anyone there would have been trespassing at that time of night. After a few minutes, I went out of the office into the barn aisle with a bat to turn off the creepy ass music. The light I usually kept on so I could see around was off, so it was pitch dark in most of the barn. My dog was just staring out the barn door, which I kept open in the summer to keep the horses cooler, with his hair bristled, but wasn't leaving the barn, which he was allowed to do. I wrote it off as creepy as duck, but ultimately just one of those things, like it's weird and I can't explain it, but there's got to be an explanation I'm just not privy to. But the real scary part is that my property shared a private gate in back with the property closest to mine, which had a gate at the back. Most of my property was fenced because of the horses, and the property next to mine was like dozens of acres fenced with a chain link fence, which, if you know anything about rural fencing, is not done. Anyways, we found out later that the owner of the adjoining property was Todd Colehep, the South Carolina serial killer. He had a woman chained up like a dog on his property. He also had some bodies of people he killed buried on his property. He was doing all that stuff while I lived next to him. In fact, I used to ride on his property, but would always turn around if I heard machinery, in retrospect, probably burying bodies, or got the creeps, like something would tell me to turn around and go home. I was probably one of the few, if not only person besides his friends who were abusing the woman, to go on his property while all that was going on. Story 6. I'm a geophysicist, and I'm out to do survey work about 1/3 of the time. A lot of our surveys are in remote locations. I was doing one in my home province of Saskatchewan, very far north, about a 6-hour drive from the nearest small town, and then a 45 minutes helicopter ride into our camp. It's isolated, and this survey began in October of last year, so it's quite dark a lot of the time. My room was on the attic of our only building, and the wood-burning stove that heated the place was directly below my room, so I often had to leave the window open at night. One night I had the window open and I could hear singing from outside, which was creepy, but I figured it was just a member of the crew who can't sleep. The next night I hear the same thing at the same time, about 3 a.m., and this time I get up to go to the bathroom. Everyone else was sleeping in cots in a large open room, and when I'm heading back to my room, I realize that everyone is in their cots. I don't hear the singing again for a few days, and it stops creeping me out. Until about a week later, I wake up and hear it. I go to check, and once again everyone is in their cots. I put my huge winter jacket on. I head outside and walk towards the sound. I step right up to the shore of the lake that we're on, and I hear it coming from somewhere across the lake. The moon is up and very bright, and I see somebody in the lake, which is absolutely freezing, as in, it has started to ice over. At this point, I am terrified, but I call out in case they needed help. They dive down under the water, and I don't see them ever again or hear the singing. It feels like a dream to this day. What the duck? Story 7. I don't believe in ghosts, but I did see something once that I can't explain, and I have chalked it up to a trick of the brain. I used to work at a resort deep in Algonquin Park. It was basically rustic living for super rich people. It was a half-hour drive to cell service and an hour drive to the nearest town. I finished my late shift at about midnight, and I was walking back to my cabin. I clearly saw an elderly man with suspenders and a plaid shirt walking by me on the path. We were not allowed to speak to the guests unless they spoke to us first, so I didn't say anything to him. It was pretty dark, too. I turned around to make sure he was headed the right way to the guest cabins, and he had straight up disappeared. There was nowhere for him to go except into the thick woods, and if he had done that, I would have heard it. Very strange. Story 8. Not working in a remote place, but a holiday in a remote part of Iceland. I've always wanted to see the Northern Lights, so I spent a week traveling around Iceland a few years ago. The weather was mostly cloudy, so I didn't get to see anything for the first 5 days. On the second to last night, we were staying at a little place in the middle of nowhere. I'd booked an Airbnb, but when we finally found the place, it was an old rundown farm, just a couple of buildings at the end of a long dirt road. It was 40 miles away from the nearest other house. Just old man and a cat that lived there, and he had put his spare bedroom on Airbnb and said he would provide breakfast. It was due to be cloudy again, so I didn't bother staying up. At about 3:30 in the morning, something woke me up, and I could see an eerie green glow coming in through the windows, and realized that the Northern Lights were performing. It was bitterly cold, so I put on several layers of warm clothes, grabbed my camera and tripod, and headed outside. The northern lights were clearly there, but a couple of electric light bulbs outside the farmhouse meant that it was barely visible in the photos that I took. I couldn't find the light switch, so I used the torch from my camera and headed out across the fields. I had walked about 150 m, climbed over a couple of fences, and got to a fairly large dip in the ground. Here I was in almost complete darkness, which meant the faint glow in the sky looked better. I set up the tripod with shivering fingers. I had to take my gloves off to fiddle with the clasps and mounted my camera. I started to hear some strange noises from around me, some rustling like there was something moving slowly, but it was windy, so I convinced myself that it was just something blowing around. Occasionally, the noises would stop for a few minutes before starting again, but I tried to just focus on taking the pictures and getting back quickly. It was tough to get the camera in the right place as I couldn't see anything through the viewfinder or on the screen. I had wanted to get a slow exposure, so as I clicked the button, I had to wait, as still as possible, for about 30 seconds. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Something was running towards me at high speed, really fast, somehow running in the pitch blackness across very bumpy ground. Even with a torch, I had had to take it slow and careful. I couldn't see anything at all, and I freaked out. I don't think I screamed, but I felt absolute panic, gasped, as my fight-or-flight response tensed every muscle in my body. The footsteps reached me, and I felt a cat rubbing against my legs in an affectionate way. The farm cat must have followed me. After I caught my breath and laughed so hard that I felt a little lightheaded, I stayed out there for another 10 mines, took a few lovely photos, and then headed back to the farmhouse to go back to bed. Story 9. I'm an avid hunter in a rural town in Missouri. My family hunts on public land, and we have hunted on the same ridge for multiple generations. The land used to be kept by a large sawmill that used mules to drag the trees to the mill in the nearby town. We have found all sorts of crazy stuff. Railroad spikes in the middle of the woods, horse sescorts grown into the side of a tree where they hung it on a limb. One of the craziest things I found in the woods was where a wagon had fell off the side of the ridge, taking the mules with it. It's something like 200 feet drop, so they just left everything down there. I hiked by this thing 100 times going to and from our hunting spot. The wood's all rotted from it, but the metal brackets and wheels were still there, grown over and taken back by nature. One day, while walking in the woods, I get to my spot that is probably half a mile from that spot, and I've been sitting there for a few hours when I hear what sounds like people yelling down the ridge, followed by a loud scream and a crashing sound. I grab my gear and start on my way out. When I get by where the wagon debris was a flower wreath laid over the wagon, but I've never seen anyone down there except for my family members, and no one knows who put it there. We talked about that night back at camp, and we could only assume that if someone had died in that wagon, maybe it was some distant grandchild or something, and that day was the anniversary of it happening, but that still doesn't explain the sounds that I'd heard. I still hunt down in the same place as always, but I've never heard or seen anything since. Story 10. My cousin was a deep-water diver welder on offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. When working at night or working really deep, it is absolutely pitch dark. You can't see anything. That in itself is a little creepy. To add to the uneasiness, he said that sometimes he would be hit with a big swirl of water, as if something very large, very close, just passed by him in the blackness. Now let's take it up another notch. Sometimes he would feel something brush up against his leg or nudge him. He said his imagination would wander, and never to a good place. Totally creeped him out every time. Story 11. I used to work for a pest control company and did most of the termite pre-treatment work. This typically involved working super late into the night to get the work done before concrete crews got started in the morning. I was on a job site for a big custom house way out in the desert. The entire job site was surrounded with high barbed wire fence with a drive-through gate. I was down in a dugout area for a basement with my truck working away when I heard the fence line rattle. I was wearing a hat-mounted flashlight, so I looked up and scanned the fence line thinking a coyote was walking along it. Instead, I found a woman trying to climb the fence but unable to get past the barbed wire portion. I have heard people say crazed look before, but never understood the statement before that moment. As soon as my flashlight hit her, she dropped back to the ground and just stood there looking at me. A lot of the night is weirdly lost in my memory, either because it was over a decade ago or because fear made me foggy, but I do remember a few things very vividly. Her eyes were as wide open as they could get, like almost popping out of their sockets. She kept muttering to herself, but I couldn't hear what she was saying, and when she wasn't talking, she kept kind of smiling like her face muscles were trying to pull her mouth open. All she was wearing was a super dirty and torn up long shirt or dress, and she had no sescorts on. She kept walking back and forth along the fence line, and I was pretty sure she was looking for a way in. I always locked myself in construction sites when working, and thankfully I did that night too. It felt like it took me forever to get my equipment stowed and the pistol out of my truck cab, all while trying to keep an eye on the woman. She just kept staring at me, muttering and pacing the fence line. I was able to reach the police, but it took almost 40 minutes for a sheriff's officer to get out to me. As soon as his car started making noise on the dirt road leading to the work site, the lady ran off into the desert. I'm sure she was drugged out of her head or something, but I still don't know how she got that far out of town in the dark with no sasquatch on. I was a good 30 minutes or more out of town driving, much less on foot. I still have an occasional nightmare about it, and it always ends with me forgetting I left the gate open and panic running back to the truck. Story 12. I worked at a Boy Scout camp for 2 years in high school as a summer gig. A requirement for the Scouts to earn their Wilderness Survival Merit Badge was for them to set up shelters among other activities. Before I was staff, the Scouts would go 12-ish miles into the woods for their night out to a place called Shelby's Dream. The stories of kids waking up screaming, talking about seeing ghosts running at them, being hung from trees, and other wild experiences. Everybody wrote those kids off, called them crazy. Eventually there were things people couldn't explain, such as staff members waking up with scratches and cuts on their bodies. The backstory of the place is that there was a mass killing of Southern soldiers, American Civil War, and Shelby was the daughter of the Southern captain who was hung with his men. She supposedly came back to the camp to find her father and all his men hung from the trees. We stopped sending the groups to that location a few years back. One night, my cabin mates and I went out there to see if the rumors were true about that place. I heard voices, cries, and screams that escort in the forest. There's a point where you cross a bridge, and once over the bridge, the wilderness stops. The woods continue, but there's no noise from animals or insects on that side. Absolute silence. That was one of the creepiest things I've ever experienced. Story 13. I work for a power company restoring power after a storm. Was working when a lady came up complaining that her power went out. We explained to her that's why we were there and she should have power back soon. She said, "Oh good, my son went down in the basement and now I can't find him." I went with her with a flashlight down the road to a rundown house that was partially caved in. She walked inside and I went to follow. As soon as I walked into the door, she disappeared from my sight and I called for her multiple times. No one responded, so I ran back to our work truck to call for help. A man that was living on her street called to me, asking what's wrong, and I told him the situation. He looked at me with a cold stare and said a mom and her son died in that house 4 years ago. I'm still shook to this day. Story 14. I was walking with my cousins about 14 years ago when we found what looked like an old, burned-out house. So, naturally being kids at the time and having no sense of self-preservation, we decided to explore it. Mostly it was just full of charred wooden crap and junk. But then one of my cousins found an entrance to a cellar outside. We busted the old rusted lock off the door and looked down inside. It was dark down there, and we didn't really have any reason to go poking around it. Plus, we were starting to get creeped out, so we kicked some dirt down into it and walked off. When we get about 15 yards away from the house, one cousin says he hears a noise, so we stop. And yep, there was noise like somebody coming up the rotting cellar stairs of the house. We peek back through the trees and see a dark kind of fuzzy shape crawl out of the cellar, which we left open. It looked kind of like a big old dog, and then it stood upright. We hauled ducking ass out of there. We all ran off in different directions like gits, each of us convinced whatever the cellar thing was chasing us. I ran right through some briars in a panic and tore my arms and legs all up, which got me in trouble when I got home. We were all fine otherwise, but we did avoid going that far back into the woods after that for a long time. Closest thing I can figure is there was a small black bear living in the cellar. Maybe it had another entrance we didn't know about, and we woke it up being little holes. But seeing something hairy and dark come out of that cellar then stand up was like being in a horror movie. I never want to see that old house again. Story 15. I was about 14 years old when my dad went away on business for a couple weeks, leaving me to tend the farm by myself. Mostly just feeding horses and chickens, not a big deal. Farm was way outside of town and down a dirt road. Nearest neighbors were 2 pastures away, and my dad insisted on never locking the doors. After the first few nights, I started hearing tapping on the windows late at night, so obviously I broke Dad's rules and started locking the front and back doors. Then the window tapping advanced to door rattling, and then I started finding odd things around the farm while doing chores. One morning I found the horses stuffing themselves in the hay storage stall. The latch for that stall was very stiff and a little complicated, so it had obviously been opened by a person and not the horses. The worst morning, I stepped out on the back porch and found all the chickens sitting in a row along the side of a shed, evenly spaced, with their necks broken. 1 or 2 were still moving a bit. They looked set out on display. The chicken yard latch had obviously been opened by a person and left open. The worst part of all of this was when my dad finally came home, blamed me for every bit of oddness and disaster, and acted like I was stupid for being scared. He insisted that the horses opened the hay stall latch and that the dogs were responsible for the open chicken yard and line of posed, broken-necked chickens. I think it's worth mentioning that our next-door neighbor was well known for being bat-crap crazy. Documented bits of crazy that my dad was entirely aware of included putting bear traps in his haystack to catch the kids who had been playing in it, and blocking off a neighbor's driveway with a load of dirt. as revenge for not letting him ride his horses on their property. So my guess is, bat-crap crazy neighbor could see that my dad's vehicle was gone, could hear my music turned up in the distance across the pastures, and figured terrorizing a middle school girl would be a fun hobby for a couple weeks. Story 16, not me but my dad's coworker. Stretching the definition of work here, but I think it fits. Anyways, in the Vietnam War, this guy was part of a special forces outfit who were dropped into Laos or Cambodia to map the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Out of a group of about 20, only 3 or 4 made it out. At one point late in the operation, he was separated from the rest of his squad mates and was trying to find a river to follow back to a U.S. outpost. He said something they were always taught was to keep their rifle in their hands at all times and never set it down. After a few days of no supplies and avoiding Viet Cong, he hears the sound of rushing water and as silently as he can, makes his way toward it. After coming through some trees, he finds a river that he recognizes and immediately has this mental celebration in his mind of, "Thank God I've made it." And in his haste to get some water in his dehydrated system, sets his rifle down. He said he was guzzling water when all of a sudden he hears this snapping sound, like a branch cracking directly behind him. He said he immediately closed his eyes and prepared for a bullet to enter his skull. After a few seconds pass, and he isn't departing the world to meet his maker, he opens his eyes and slowly turns around. 5 feet away, a Buddhist monk is standing in the middle of the jungle. The monk raises a finger to his lips and beckons him to follow. Turns out, a monastery is nearby, and the monks were sympathetic to the U.S. They ended up sheltering him for a few weeks until they got him back to us forces. Crazy enough, years later, he ended up running into the same monk that saved his life at a remote Buddhist temple in the U.S. They remained friends until the monk passed away from cancer. Story 17. Archaeologist here. We had found a rural graveyard on USFS land in the middle of some mountain foothills in Nevada and had started recording some features of the site. We noticed there were these creepy little porcelain angel figures on top of the graves, meaning that these were not super old graves, or at least were being somewhat maintained. We didn't have enough time to finish before sundown, so we wrapped it up and headed back to the bunkhouse. When we came back Monday to finish the site, all the angels had been systematically covered by old cow patties, like someone was trying to hide them from us. That meant A, people had been watching us that Friday afternoon, unbeknownst to us. B, people didn't want us there. We called the USFS archaeologist we had been working with, and she told us to finish and leave as quickly as possible. Story 18. Random people coming out of the woods is something you don't ever get used to, really. I grew up on a drilling rig my dad ran. When I was old enough to stand up and steer a pickup between hay bales, I started doing that and pulling wells, oil well repair. With cell phones, it's a lot less common, but vividly remember skipping rocks at a pond and meeting a few randos who broke down nearby looking for a ride. Story 19. One night I was driving out on a remote country round and it was snowing pretty heavily. I got a call from my mom telling me to get home as there was a pretty large blizzard and the roads were only going to get worse. At a T in the road, I went to make a turn, only to see someone standing in the middle of the road in a light hoodie. With no houses around for about a half mile, I'm not sure why anyone would be walking out in a blizzard. As I swerved past, the person didn't flinch and looked right into my window. However, it was too dark to make out a face. It stopped snowing shortly after I got home, and the next day, I went back out to the road to see if I could find any traces. I could clearly see my car tracks, but there were no footprints anywhere. It definitely could have been some kook out for a late-night hike, but it was still pretty creepy. Story 20. I used to deliver hotshot freight across the Great Plains, Minnesota area. One night around 2 a.m., I was hauling across North Dakota trying to reach Montana by morning. I was delivering a particularly valuable tractor part that a farm desperately needed for the following day. I began to notice some highway hypnosis sneaking up on me, but it didn't really bother me because I'd been through it hundreds of times before. Anyone who has driven across North Dakota knows that it is incredibly flat, like really flat. There also tends to be very straight and long roads. It's somewhat easy to see things on the road that are far away, even at night. I noticed something long on the road, spanning my entire lane, approximately half a mile in front of me. I slowed down a little and prepared to move into the opposite lane, thinking it was some retread off a blown tire. As I got closer, I noticed it was 2 people, laying head to toe across the entire lane. I swerved into the other lane, successfully avoiding them, and came to an almost complete stop. But they didn't move, not an inch. I was just about to back up and check on them when I remembered a story that an old graybeard colleague of mine told me. He told me that in certain remote areas, people will lie down in the middle of the road and wait for a car or truck to stop and see what's going on. At that point, the road layers along with whoever else is hiding in the nearby bushes will beat the crap out of the driver and steal his vehicle, leaving him in the middle of nowhere. I decided not to back up, and when the 2 people in the road saw me put my truck back in gear and drive away, they both got up and walked toward the shoulder. I called the police and explained what happened, but we were so far away from civilization that I doubt anything came of it. Thanks to that old graybeard, I got to keep my truck, my job, and my teeth. Story 21. I used to work with wildlife conservation and anti-poaching teams throughout sub-Saharan Africa as an ecologist and ranger, so I have lots of stories. The thing that always bothered me the most were leopards. In one reserve, we had a local guy who ran his own small guiding business. He would cruise around in his 80s Land Cruiser packed full with tourists and was notorious for breaking the rules. No off-trail driving, don't get too close to animals, etc., which is probably why people always booked him because they almost always saw more. Anyway, one day he stopped his cruiser on a concrete and iron bridge that carried its users over a creek that swelled and cascaded through the valley during the wet season. It was dry season, so the creek bed was cracked and bone dry. He let his passengers out to take pictures down the creek bed. It was a rather scenic spot. He said he had to take a leak, so he walked to the far side of the bridge and disappeared under the spot where the bridge connected to the top of the berm that slowly sloped 30 hours down to the bottom of the creek bed. Next thing the tourists snapping pics on the bridge see is a massive leopard bound out from under the bridge carrying the guide's body by his neck. As soon as it appeared, it vanished, and a body was never found. All they located was a pack of cigarettes and a lighter he must have dropped in the attack. His last act of rule-breaking got him killed. In a different location, a young tourist on vacation with her family slept on the open-air second floor of the lodge they'd rented despite being told not to. In the morning, her family came out to find the shredded hammock, pieces of clothes, and blood. They eventually found what was left of her stuffed in a tree not far away. Have lots of other crazy stories about poachers, moody magic, farm raids, civil unrest, animal attacks, lost missing people, etc., etc., if anyone is interested. At work now, though, so can't post too much till later. Story 22. I used to work for a company that specialized in hazmat, restoration, and working in confined spaces. We traveled around the country depending on the type of contracts we had. We dealt with some pretty cool and sometimes creepy stuff. One that comes to mind was at a haunted Indian school. The story goes that it was run by Christians and that they had a tendency to lose Native American children. My boss had called me and a few other in one so we could pick our crews and go over the plans. Most of us already had people in our crews that we liked due to specific skills or because of their demeanor. This time, we were instructed to pick guys who could keep cool at all times, since this job wouldn't really need anything special. It was going to be demoed by another crew after we went in. We got a warning about the building. The boss let us know that people broke into it all the time to do crazy witchcraft stuff and to be careful of anyone who might reside in it, such as hobos, cultist O, and ghosts, because it was supposedly haunted as fuck. At the site, our radios would go off and sometimes hear someone talking. We thought it was interference. Our harnesses would get tugged on and no one was there. And a few times I got to hear voices or people calling my name. I believe the place was haunted, and so did most of the guys. Several used to hold prayer circles before we went in, and a few refused to go in and would ask to be moved to a different job site, which we would do for their safety and ours. Quite a few things happened there, but nothing I can really call malicious. Just really creepy. Story 23. I am a structural engineer and do routine in-service bridge inspections. Basically, after I-35W collapse, every bridge in the US needs to be inspected every 2 years, so I get to go to remote places where people don't expect other people to go, both in the city and out in the boonies. I have found knives that were suspicious, countless homeless camps, substances, bones, porn stashes, all sorts of crazy things that people hide. One that stands out to me, though, it was an inspection on a tub girder bridge, and we actually have to climb into the tub girders and walk through them to look for cracks. Creepy in the first place. There's a hatch at either end, and the dots are very careful to make sure they are padlocked. But this one wasn't because it was rather new. Well, we open the hatch and climb in. We do this in teams for many safety reasons. And it smells, and I mean stinks in here. There is some ventilation, but this is not a space that the steel fabricators meant for people to be. Well, we start walking and inspecting, but the smell keeps getting worse and worse. The turd covered in burnt hair smell from Anchorman comes to mind. Well, after walking for about 10 minutes, we find what the smell was. Assumed homeless person had started a fire inside of the tub girder, and it appeared they were planning to cook some sort of dead rodent as it was on a stick. Well, with the bad ventilation, they must have been quickly smoked out, and they just left the dead animal along with clothes and random belongings, so we covered our noses as best we could and continued. The tub girders have stiffeners in them, so this thing is divided up into rooms with little doors to climb through, like what you see on submarines. Well, we came upon the previous occupant's bathroom section and decided to turn around and call it a day. We got a ladder and went in from the other side, knowing full well where we left off. We made notes of the situation for the sorry sucker that has to inspect it next time and crossed our fingers. It isn't us. Story 24. When I worked in a kennels up the mountains, in the depths of winter, it would be dark by 5 p.m. I'd be in the office finishing up some paperwork. At this stage, everyone would be gone, and this particular building was a bit away from the main building, car park, etc. All the dogs would be sleeping by this time after a busy day. You could hear a pin drop. Sometimes I would hear heavy, definite, slow footsteps so much so that I would get up, come out onto the main floor, ready to explain we are now closed, but no one would be there. It used to freak me out a couple of times. I would even check the dogs in case it was coming from a kennel, but nope, all sound asleep. Story 25. My dad told me a sea tale of his days working on ocean-going barges. He said one night they were underway with heavy seas and had to adjust the tie-up between the tugboat and the barge. Forgive my nautical blasphemy, I'm butchering these terms. He was the one with the time offshore. He described doing anything on deck, at night, in a storm, as about the most dangerous thing you possibly do because outside of the weather and risk of going overboard, there was such high tension on various cables that if anything snapped, it might come across the deck and cut someone in half. Now, he said this particular seagoing tug had had some history. One of the previous crew had gone missing before Dad's time on the crew, and from the way it wasn't discussed, but occasionally alluded to, there may have been foul play. So, in the midst of the storm, with danger and tension high, an argument broke out. Two of the crew started yelling at each other, and at the moment that everyone thought it might come to violence, a fire axe flew across the deck and landed between their feet. No one was near the wall where it had been strapped down. A fire axe has its own bracket welded to a wall with straps to hold it in place unless it's needed. They don't just come loose on their own, and the odds of it landing at their feet were impossible, except that the two arguing were also the ones who had fought with the lost sailor. They did not fight. They put the axe back in the rack. Everyone finished their work quietly, and it was not spoken of again until they returned to shore. Story 26. I don't work in a remote place, but I have a house out in the middle of nowhere that I rarely ever get to see. The town has a population of roughly 30-40ths people, all of whom have acres and acres between each other. My in-laws who live nearby have been noticing at least 2 or 3 of their chickens missing every other day and assumed it was a fox. The usual. Anyway, one night myself and my wife are doing a bit of work on our fences around our land, and we hear this thrumming noise coming from the adjacent acreage, which is completely overgrown. You can't even see through it, let alone walk through it. The only way I can describe it is like a cat purring. But you know, a ducking, massive cat. The entire bushland seemed to reverberate with the sound. Needless to say, we made a hasty retreat and try not to go out at night when we're there, more so than we did before due to all the undiscovered mines. Story 27. I grew up in Michigan before it was fashionable to kidnap the governor. Backpacking in the Pigeon River State Forest happened multiple times every year. On one fateful trip, we had closed down for the night. We're enjoying the campfire and listening to the night noises. Our campsite was up on a bluff away from the river. I should mention that the experience was nicely enhanced by smoking the devil's salad. All of a sudden, we could hear something walking effortlessly through the water. We froze and looked at each other, eyes big as saucers, knowing our time had come. We quickly realized that whatever was moving through the water was not one, but many. Certain that we were dinner for a whole family of Sasquatch, we did a military crawl to the edge of the bluff to identify our killer. Through the moonlight, we could see the elk herd casually walking by the campsite as they headed to wherever they were going to bed down for the night. We watched in silence as those beautiful animals moved so graciously through the river. After they left, we walked back to our campfire and laughed uncontrollably as we tried to accuse each other of being the most scared that night. I think of that experience from time to time and smile from the memory. Thanks, Op, for bringing it to mind again. Story 28. I work in northern British Columbia doing bush grinding. My brother and I go in after the logging companies and grind all the leftover piles of wood into trucks to take to the mills for wood pellets. Back in February of this year, we were on night shift about 3 hours from the closest town, and the few locals that lived out there warned us about a pack of timberwolves that was about 25 strong and oddly fearless. It was about 3 in the morning, and we had worked our way down the block road about half a mile, and one of us needed to walk back to the pickup truck to bring it closer to fuel up the machines. Of course, I drew the short straw and went for a walk. Not even halfway to the truck, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like I was being watched, so I swept my flashlight beam across the tree line, and all the eyes watching me lit up. Of course, I left my shotgun in the truck, and I didn't think running was a wise idea. So I kept walking swiftly while focused on the tree line, watching the eyes follow me the rest of the way back to the truck. I got to the truck fine and obviously never left it too far away again. I've had many creepy and interesting encounters in the bush, but this one was definitely one of the oh crap moments. Story 29. I used to work out in the woods in Florida a lot. Creepiest thing would be this day. We were working near Big Cypress, tromping through the brush all day. At the end of the day, my coworker and I do a quick drive-through of some of the property and realized the place was absolutely infested with water moccasins. We had been unknowingly essentially walking around a giant water moccasin pit all day. That one kind of ducked me up. Story 30. I don't really work in remote areas, but my job takes me to places people don't see. I'm an insurance adjuster. I had a claim at a hospital. They knew they had a claim when they could smell sewage from the operating theater. Turns out it was a burst sewage pipe in July, in Texas. By the time I got there, they had already vacuumed out the majority of the sewage and spread lime. I had to go down into the crawl space and get photos of the burst pipe in order to determine how it happened. I get in a full Tyvek suit with a respirator. The clearance is about 3 feet, and there's pipes everywhere. So I'm crawling around like Catherine Zeta-Jones in The Entrapment, also an insurance adjuster. I've got gnats flying into my mouth around the gap in the respirator on my nose. I hate bugs. I've got to go like 100 or so feet to get to the burst pipe. As I get deeper in there, I glance at one of the foundation walls with my flashlight. It's glistening. I figured it's water, but if that much is pouring in, that could be relevant. So I crawl closer. Did I mention it was still wet from the sewage down there? So every time my knee or hand moved to a new position, it sunk into the wet, formerly poopy dirt. As I get closer, I realize the glistening on the wall isn't moving down as it would with gravity. I get closer still. All of a sudden it clicks. The entirety of the foundation wall is covered in cockroaches. Long story short, it was a crafty, pun intended, Chinese iron pipe. The insurance company paid for new clothes, and I billed the time it took me to take a shower and drown what I saw with booze. Despite that story, none of it comes close to the horror you can walk into while inspecting low-rent apartment complexes. Story 31. I worked at an oil refinery for a while, and everyone told stories of this guy who would eat chips while taking a crap. I'm pretty skeptical by nature, and coupling that with the general level ducking around amongst my peers, I figured it was just a myth. Well, one night I'm working my 10th 12-hour night shift in a row, so I've had more than a few cups of coffee and find myself in dire need of a crap around 3 a.m. So I head into the old mobile crap trailer, think 30 feet double-wide trailer full of urinals and stalls. So there I am, pants, coveralls, and a couple sweaters at my ankles, phone in hand, minding my own business. When I hear the door creak open and the shuffling of feet and the rustling of coveralls as someone pops into the stall next to me. At this point, I'm already thinking this dude's is weird. There are 30 stalls, and he went into the one next to the one in use. But the weird level got turned up to 11 when I hear the telltale rustle of a chip bag. My brain instantly recalls the stories of the chip crafter. I listen in disbelief as this fiend rips open his bag of munchies and digs in. The sounds of that monster munching down potato chips while simultaneously unloading what can only be described as a crime against humanity into that toilet will haunt my nightmares until the end of my days. Story 32. We live in a remote campsite for a mine construction crew in sub-Saharan Africa. One night after a long, endless day, I got the feeling I was being watched while I was walking from the car park to the housing unit. I fell into deep sleep soon as I hit the sack. I didn't even wash the day's grime off of me, nor did I even take my C-skirts and clothes off. I just fell into bed. Anyway, I was jolted awake by crazy hair-raising screaming, like someone was being stabbed or something. I was scared crapless, but at the same time I felt I had to help, grab my torch and hammer and walked out the unit and creeped towards the noise. The screaming stopped as I got closer. For some reason, this scared me even more. I loosened my grip on the hammer when I realized my knuckles' skin were stretched tight and prepared for whatever may come. What I saw and heard will forever haunt me. I heard the crunching of bones, the drip, drip, drip of what could only be blood. Still couldn't see anything. I circled the car park and stopped dead in my tracks. There was the back half of a large Impala with its guts spilled out and a trail of blood and crap leading behind my car. I crept up around the car and peered. 4 large wild dogs were munching on the other half of the animal. Their eyes glowed red. Their blood-matted fur and suits together with the earlier feeling of being watched sent chills down my spine. I don't know how I was able to sneak back to the housing unit unnoticed. I checked the doors and windows, and for some reason fell right back into deep sleep, hammer in hand. Story 33. I used to work as a tree planter and have spent thousands of hours in the deep woods. To be honest, there is nothing creepy in the forest other than carcasses and the sound of animals. But I will always say that the forest is alive and you need to respect it, because in the woods, you're on nature's terms. If you don't, the forest will disrespect you back. It is very easy to become lost and disoriented without a compass. And there are many perils that the woods can manifest to injure, maim, or kill you. Don't duck with the woods. Story 34. I've worked temporarily isolated, night shift in university biomed labs. I'm a pretty rational person, but your mind plays tricks on you. The worst part was when I had to walk to a different room, walking through pitch-black corridors, waiting for the motion sensors to pick me up and turn on. There was nothing I could do to turn them on before that. No manual switches or anything to save power and maintain sterility. When the lights turned on, I was always spooked that I wouldn't be alone. It's pretty disorienting going from no light to high light. I had a habit of working way too long, like 20-hour days too, starting early in the morning. When you're that tired and maintaining such high focus, you start to straight up hallucinate. That was pretty scary. I would see shadowy figures gliding along behind me in window reflections. When you only have the hum of a freezer for company, you start to get twitchy, like hearing doors opening and closing far away in the building, the electrics clicking and thumping, and the vents turning on and off. Sometimes all the sounds just stop and you wish to God the freezer pump would come on again or something. Scariest moment I ever had was going from one room to another. The authentication lock on a side door goes green and clicks open. There was nobody in there. I could see the window, it was dark, and nobody opened the door. Stood with my heart in my mouth for ages. Then it clicks red again. God help me. I didn't open that door, I just tried not to think about it. Story 35. I lived in remote coast studying sage grouse. I was way the duck out there by myself, and no cell service. One day I was particularly deep walking plots and looking for bird crap. It was starting to get dark, so I headed back to my four-wheeler. To my surprise, the key was missing, and there was a 30.06 shell just sitting there. Damn, I was prob 3. 4 hike out to my cabin, and it was getting cold and dark fast. After about an hour, I found the key in some shrubs. As I drove off, I heard a very close-by gunshot. The whole experience was terrifying. I assume it was some poacher just ducking with me, but damn it took the co-wilderness fun meter down a whole lot. Story 36. I work in environmental remediation and go to tons of abandoned buildings and remote sites. One of the creepiest places I've ever been was an abandoned electrical parts factory in PA. Wasn't remote, but the building was abandoned, gutted, and not maintained for 25 plus years. The roof was mostly gone, the ground floor collapsed into the basement, 30 feet down, and it was pitch dark in most of the building. We had to sample from inside the building, so I sat in there with just a headlamp and small lantern, which intensified the dark around me. I heard scuffling off across the building and nearly crapped my pants. I turned to look and saw nothing. I stared for a long time in silence before I got up to get a closer look. It came from a room across the building, which was absolute black with no light infiltrating in. Imagine playing Slender Man, but IRL. The room had a 20-foot ceiling and was filled floor to ceiling with mattresses. Old, wet, rotten. And out from the pile was a squad of raccoons eating some crap. I just went back to my spot and finished sampling so I could get the hell out of there. Best part? I get to go back to resample next week. Mau pray form. Story 37. I've spent quite a bit of time in remote areas, both for my job, wildland firefighter, and recreationally. Never seen anything really weird. But the creepiest thing I've seen was near one of our prescribed burn units in the middle of nowhere. We used to regularly see the same truck out there driven by the most stereotypical creepy-looking dude you could think of, always with a different, much younger woman in the passenger seat. We, of course, reported him to local law enforcement, but I moved to a new job shortly after, so I don't know if anything ever came of it. Story 38. I fly helicopters over power lines in remote parts of the country. I once saw what I thought was a human leg sticking out of the woods into a very small clearing in the trees. It shook me enough. I went back to the LZ and got one of the ground crewmen to go back and look while I hovered as low as I could get without hitting the rotors on the trees. We get there and he says he can't see exactly what it is. We go back and grab a pair of binoculars so he can get a closer look. Turned out to be a cow. The catch was it had no skin, like none at all. A perfect cow sans all of its skin. No animals had eaten it yet, so it was still fully intact. There were no farms around for a 50-mile radius. I still have no clue how it ended up there in the manner it was in. I still remember the duck that's a body feeling I had when I think of this story. Story 39. On a solo overnight trip in the Sierra, north of Yosemite but south of Tayscourt. Whilst descending to a river, I found a pile of animal carcasses. Dead center of the trail in a spot by said river where the trees thinned out a bit. Just a gross-deck, smelly splay of dead animals. It's hard to say how many complete animals there were given the state of them. Some bones and limbs scattered around, but the primary pile consisted of animal skeletons. A couple of elk, I don't know my game animals, but one seemed kind of fresh, one was certainly not. And one last animal that was so rotted and falling apart that I can only say I think it was a horse. It was huge. I don't know if it was a bad call or not, but I kept going and spent the night at my destination. I've kind of presumed it was a mountain lion, but I don't know enough about how they hunt. I thought it was strange that these carcasses were clustered because they had to have been dragged there, right? And a horse? Not a huge horse by any means, but without a doubt bigger than the elk, or whatever game that was. At any rate, I was definitely uneasy the whole time, and ended up adding a few miles so that I could take a different trail out. Was very spooked. Story 40. My buddy went to Singapore for his military jungle training. He was woken up for his guard shift and noticed a foot-long, very venomous, centipede curled up on top of his sleeping bag. He was trying to stay calm, and then his Ice for Blood buddy reached down, grabbed the thing by the head, walked outside, and chucked it into the forest. Apparently, the last thing he heard while the guy was walking outside with the little arthropod's head clamped in his fingers sounded like a hissing noise. Story 41. This is probably be buried here. I seem to be late to the party. I used to make furniture on an old farm in the English countryside. Not that remote compared to others in this thread, but as remote as you get in England while still being on a farm. I used to work long ducking hours because it was my own company. The building was just a converted cowshed with machines in it. If I knew I was going to be very late, I would go down to the gate at the roadside and lock myself in. I didn't want anyone driving in there at night. I did that one evening, and at about 1 a.m., working to a deadline, I could see car lights through the shutters. I thought it was weird because I was sure I locked myself in. But before the car even came to a halt, someone started hammering the duck out of the shutter. This made me jump, and I took a moment to chill out. The person was still banging on the shutter. But as I turned off the machine and walked to the entrance, I was more pissed off. The person stopped just as I was opening the shutter. No person, no car, nothing other than the dark, quiet night. Decided I'd duck off home and miss the work deadline. Sure enough, the gate at the roadside was locked. Story 42. And when I was in college, I interned with the Forest Service. A lot of the time, I just spent patrolling hiking trails. Right near Grandfather Mountain, I thought I heard someone yelling for help, but my supervisor told me to ignore it. Apparently, someone went missing in the area in the 60s and was never found, and people would hear that voice all the time. I heard it twice more after that, and it always creeped me out. Story 43. I work a forest ranger in the States. I've seen some creepy things, but nothing like this one bear that used to stalk me and some of the other hikers in the area. It didn't act like any other bear. It would just follow you. It would try to hide in a bush or someplace elsewhere behind you. It didn't do anything. It would just follow you. Turns out it was a dude in a suit who only got caught because he attacked the wrong redneck. Story 44. Not me, but my dad. Years ago, he was working alone as a geologist in the middle of Bodmin Moor in Cornwall. The moor is hilly, treeless, windswept, bleak, very old, and very atmospheric. It was early one morning and the moor was covered in low-lying fog. Dad was surveying a dip in the landscape when he heard a strange, screeching, wailing coming from behind a ridge. The fog and shape of the land was such that he couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, and he was spooked. As the sound increased in intensity, a herd of sheep suddenly appeared through the fog, then followed by a man in full Scottish regalia, kilt and all, playing a set of bagpipes. Dad assumed it was no apparition, and when he spoke with the man, it turned he was a local farmer who had relocated from Scotland and found that the isolated moor was the perfect place to practice playing his bagpipes without disturbing anybody. Have you heard bagpipes? He'd be doing it for so long that the sheep had developed a sort of Pavlovian response to the sound, and he could successfully herd them using his bagpipes instead of his dog. He dressed up because why the hell not? Story 45. Forest officer here, working double shifted on a wildfire incident after driving 9+ hours and having worked a full shift the day before. It was about 3 in the morning. Very scent smoke soon couldn't see very far from the fire line I was holding. I kept seeing 2 reflections from my headlamp in the distant smog, like little glints of light where there should be none. They kept getting closer and closer, but only when I wasn't looking directly at the source. This went on for about half an hour until the thing got close enough I could hear it moving through the crispy brush. Crunch, crunch, SC crunch, it sounded big. I got nervous at this point. The hairs on my nape were on end. It's not uncommon for bears or lions to patrol fire edges looking for freshly BBQ'd critters. I got into my engine's cab and shut the door. I could still hear it getting closer still. My engine partner was fast asleep. I contemplated waking her to check out what I was seeing, hearing. Then the thing hopped out of the brush. A yearling deer. It saw me, pooped a bunch of pellets, and bounded off into the woods. It was just a spoopy lost deer. Story 46. I used to work as an engineer on a cargo ship. We were passing through the Gulf of Oman, and we had stopped earlier for security guards to board the ship for safety reasons, because that area is very dangerous. This was also the first time that I passed through that region, so I was kind of scared of the things that I've heard about happening there. And the inevitable happened, the thing that I feared the most. And yes, I think you know what I'm talking about. We got attacked by Somali pirates. I was up in the bridge doing some paperwork when I suddenly heard the alarm and the captain speaking about it. The guards were up there with me, and I went outside the bridge to see what was happening. And holy crap, it was exactly like that Captain Phillips movie if you have seen it. About 4 little boats with armed men were coming straight for the ship, firing their guns toward the bridge. The guards answered back by firing back, and the fight lasted about 5 minutes before they decided to flee due to them not being able to board the ship. Goddamn, what a truly unforgettable experience. Story 47. I do mineral exploration in Alaska. I'm often transported by helicopter to very remote regions throughout the already very remote state. A few years ago, my field partner and I came across what seemed like a bear kill of a caribou carcass. But when we got closer, it seemed odd. The only things that remained were 2 spines and 1 head. The head was arranged such that the mouth was wide open, pointing up like it was screaming towards the heavens. The eyes were cut out. Very weird. There's also been many instances of coming across old miners' buildings littered with dog skeletons or having strangely new children's clothing strewn about. Story 48. Not for work, but I grew up in very rural Oklahoma and did a lot of pig hunting. I generally bow hunted, but always carried a sidearm just in case. Anyway, I come across tracks and I can tell by the stride that it's a huge hog, so I start tracking. I don't know if you've ever tracked, but you kind of get tunnel vision, just looking for sign. Anyway, I'm tracking for about an hour when I realize I've tracked in a circle and I'm looking at my own tracings. Then I heard this 300-pound pig snort behind me. Yep, a ducking pig tracked me into a circle and got the drop on me. So, I did what any red-blooded American badass from Oklahoma would do. I scurried my ass up the nearest tree so fast an orangutan would have clapped. Then I proceeded to pee my big boy pants while the boar rooted and tusked the base of the tree. Later, I told my friends that Pig was lucky I was in a good mood, or I'd have kicked his ass. Story 49. I work for a railroad. Not necessarily remote, but sometimes it's just a conductor and engineer cruising along around 10 mph on very isolated, fairly wooded track. I've heard a few older guys mention something about a family, or a man with a suitcase, something along those lines, don't really remember, walking down the track with no concerns. Constant blowing of the horn, flashing of the lights, etc. just kept walking down the track, then disappearing. Near Weatherly, PA. I also experienced a pretty intense trip myself one night coming home from New Jersey. Saw my first dead body laying along the rail, which in itself was kind of interesting. Then the only other part of my trip, where we were required to run at a slow speed, I heard the craziest, blood-curdling scream I have ever heard in my entire life. One of the nights I will probably remember until I retire. Story 50. I used to work nights at a hostel. It was pretty lonely most nights, quite and dark. But now and then, I had to run and fix stuff or help someone. One time, maybe at 3 in the morning, I had to go get some tools from the workshop, where Ralph, the handyman, had his headquarters. You had to leave the hostel to get to the place, and it sat in a long, dark corridor. I used my key to enter and opened the door. It was pitch black in there. And then I heard freaking kids singing like small children, straight out of a horror movie. I freaked out. Then I remembered that Ralph had rigged the electricity to the door, and when you opened it, the radio came on. For some reason, there was some creepy kids singing on the radio at 3 in the morning. Weird, but at least they weren't going to murder me. Story 51. I used to volunteer as a scuba instructor. We'd teach 3 big classes each year, and then take them down to the Florida Keys for their open water checkout. Barracuda were the creepiest. They'd hang out just at the edge of visibility, watching you. If you moved toward them, they'd back off. If you ever dropped something or stirred up anything that looked like food, a few would dart in fast as lightning to snap it up. Then they'd go back to hovering on the edge of visibility, where you could barely see them. Flipping barracuda, man! Story 52. I used to do salmon spawning surveys, which involved walking up streams looking for fish. Some of the streams are quite remote and or inaccessible on timberland, and you don't really expect to see any other person when you're out there. As a naturally smiley, friendly, small, feminine woman, I've learned to be wary of people 100% of the time in the field. I actively try to avoid running into people when I'm alone in remote places. One of the survey locations is close to a highway. To get to it, I had to park at a pullout, follow a river downstream to a flagged trail, hike over a ridge to meet up with an old logging road on private timberland. I walked along the logging road for about 100 m before peeling off into the woods, very thick second-growth Douglas fir reprod, where game trails eventually lead to the stream at the base of the hill slope. I came here during spring to survey steelhead, but this stream was also a survey location for other types of salmon during the fall. The game trails off of the logging road were flagged by previous surveyors, and multiple routes were marked. This made it kind of confusing, and not all routes actually led to the stream. Some just petered out once the vegetation got too thick. Another led to a cliff face overlooking the riverbed, lots of faint trails. One day I turned off into the woods, one of the survey flags tied around a branch at the side of the road. I followed some pink flagging heading south along the hillside. I noticed the trail seemed freshly turned up, and figured maybe a bear clambered through recently since the time I was there last, 2 weeks previously. The trail led to a small claustrophobic clearing, and the ground was freshly torn up in the shape of a circle. Seemed strange. I was looking for elk tracks, but didn't see any. Then I noticed an assortment of bones scattered around the edges of the clearing. These weren't there before. Everything was dead silent, and something about it was setting me on edge. I poked around the bones a bit, trying to piece together this scene. I noticed another slight path which strayed from my main route, veering to the right from the clearing. I walked a bit down that way and gazed ahead, trying to see if this path was flagged. It was densely packed with trees. A subtle movement caught the corner of my eye ahead and to the right as I walked. I turned my head to look past the trees and saw the silhouette of a large shelter, maybe about 50, 75 feet from the clearing. It was surrounded by what looked to be jugs and bones. Tons of plastic jugs, light shapes of bones on the ground. The lighting made seeing anything else impossible. Everything was so quiet. I left in a hurry, off the trail, without trying to get a better look, without getting to the stream. The alarm bells in my brain were screaming.